Hello, I'm Carolyn Gibbs. My talk today is On the Edge and Round the Bend. A look at how quilters have tackled the borders and particularly the corners of their quilting designs. I'm sure you all read magazines and books and watch YouTube videos and follow discussions on social media such as Facebook, and you'll have noticed that they all concentrate heavily on patchwork, all those lovely colours and fabrics. But you will find far less about quilting. And so often you find a pattern you like with those dreaded words, quilt as desired. But other than outline quilting, many people don't know what to do. These days we do have the option of sending away to a long arm quilter, but even the overall generic patterns, such as seen on this quilt here, are not cheap, and unless you have enough money to commission a bespoke treatment, the design that you get for the quilting will not have any connection with the patchwork, geometry or layout. Many of us would love to have more confidence in developing quilting that really enhanced the patchwork, adding the finishing touch to the design, or even to move into wholecloth quilts, where the beauty of the quilted line creates texture and pattern all of its own. And for quite a while now, I've been trying to focus on this, to design quilting that harmonises with the piece design. I'm going to focus on borders today, as these are the places where we most often have a blank space to work with. So for example, I designed this border with the hearts to complement the rest of the quilt design. On this one, I chose a broad cable for this border. But even if you come up with a lovely border quilting design, the problem is, what do you do at the corner? This was the third quilt I made, and I wanted to try out a running feather border. I searched over all sorts of places to try and find guidance to how to make it sweep round the corner gracefully. Eventually I managed to work out how to do this myself. The maths is not fundamentally difficult, but there are a couple of pitfalls to getting this corner right. So if you'd like to learn how to draw out this lovely traditional design, you might like to buy my Drafting a Running Feather Technique Pack, which is available as a download from my website shop. Now, as I'd discovered, making a border turn a corner perfectly was obviously not a commonly achieved simple matter. And I started to wonder how quilters in the past had tackled this issue, particularly as many had had little formal mathematical education. And this can be seen on quite a lot of antique quilts that you look at. This one, for instance, has a running feather border, which looks quite nice here, but the corner where it tries to meet up with this side, there's definitely a kink there. It's not so good, and several of the corners on this quilt are quite awkward. So I started looking at other quilts in my collection. The one that had first triggered my interest was this one, a white quilt from the Scottish borders town of Hawick, which dates from the 1920s, 1930s. And the quilter had chosen to design a double swag inner border. Now at first glance it looks really well fitted, but when you look more closely you discover that all four corners have been placed slightly differently. For example, here the outer swag goes round like this, and then, as you might expect, the inner swag goes like that. Now compare that with what happens on the other side. Here, the outer swag joins onto the end of the inner swag, so the corner is different. And this intrigued me, and I started looking at other quilts to see how they had tackled the corners too. And I've come up with 4 categories which I now classify these corners: ignore, avoid, fudge and master. I'm going to start by looking at the corners which I call the ignore corners. This is a simple quilt dating from the late 19th or early 20th century, which came from a farmhouse in mid-Wales. This broad cable makes no attempt to turn the corner at all. It just goes straight up there, and then the next part just simply starts here and moves out. So the corners are butted, and there's no attempt to go round at all. This quilt dates from quite a bit later, from the mid-20th century, made by Mrs. Llewellyn. And we've got a very broad cable here, which again, the new one just butts on the end of this one, just against the side of the end of there. Notice that the cables are quite well placed here, but if you look closely they don't quite finish off at the same part of the design. This one has this little part of the petal, the oval, in the middle of there, but it doesn't have it here. But both corners look quite finished, don't they? On other quilt designs, the quilter has to be more careful about making sure that the beginning and the end look finished. So on this one, for instance, we have triangles, these chevrons that go along the border all the way from one end to the other. And this is quite well fitted into here, isn't it? It's a little harder to spot though, that if you look over here there's some fudging going on. Over here this last one is a bit smaller than the ones next to it. And in fact, at the end of this row, this one is a bit bigger than the others. They've carefully adjusted the size of the last one to make it fill all of the space available. Some quilters didn't seem to bother with this though. You can see here that this border with these large leaves, this leaf here, simply has part chopped off. These butted border treatments for corners can be surprisingly sophisticated. It takes quite a close study of this late 19th century Pembrokeshire quilt to realise that there are not any corner units, but in fact that the border does go straight across here, and then the next one butts on. It looks initially as though this 4-leaf unit makes a corner, but there are no dividing lines, are there? This line doesn't come across here. So it is, in fact, an ignore corner. There is a bit of fudging in the size of the leaves to make it fit as well. This quilt, which I call the pink and gold Welsh wholecloth, shows a different type of corner, which I call an avoid corner. We have a repeated motif, the paisley unit, along the border, but then in the corners, these dividing lines make a square, and there's a completely different motif that fills the corner square. This is a really easy way for a less experienced quilter to avoid complicated planning, because you can think about the border and the corner completely separately. There are more photographs of this quilt shown on my website if you'd like to see. The green farmhouse quilt that we saw earlier, with the inner cable border, has an outer border with these 4 leaves in the circles. On this side we get a complete circle at the end, and then we get a corner motif. But notice over here we've got complete circle there, but here there's only a part circle. It just blends into the corner motif, so it's a bit of fudging going on. This is another Welsh quilt, again with the lines that separate off the corners from the borders. And although at first sight it looks quite perfect, there's a bit of fudging going on if you look more closely. The inner border has this 4-leaf making a circle motif, and then these 2 leaves at the end have their points at the corners of the border. You can see the same motifs here, but the end leaves are the ones the other way around. They're the ones that finish with the points at the middle. So there's half a repeat missing compared to what we had over on this side. But you don't notice that because you've got this corner unit of the circle with the flower. This outer border design is known as church windows, and we have these repeated half circles. On this side you can see that it finishes nicely in this corner next to the dividing lines. But on this side, again, we've got half a border unit missing. It doesn't finish down at the bottom, it finishes at the top. But it looks quite well balanced, doesn't it? But you can see here we've got this shape with the 3 spirals in, but over here they've only managed to fit 2 in. But it doesn't matter, because we've still got this nice corner motif of related designs that still seems to unify it all together. This Welsh quilter has used another typical motif, the bent leaf. But you can see if you look at the size of the last bent leaf, it's quite a bit bigger. That's because she's stretched it to fill the space to go up to the corner motif very nicely. At the other end there, she's had more problems. She's managed to have complete paisleys on this side of the border, but she's had to have a half paisley here to fill in the space. When you see part motifs at the end of a border like this, it often indicates that she's marked the quilt in the frame. What do we mean by this? Well, this is a traditional quilt frame with two long poles, and only part of the quilt is exposed to be seen and worked on at any one time. So for instance, if we thought how this whole quilt was made, at the beginning, the only part the quilter could see was the strip at the end. This would have been marked and stitched, and then that would have been rolled onto a roller and the next part exposed. She would have quilted this section and then rolled it on again to expose a new section each time. Now the quilt design would have usually been marked on by drawing around card templates. Another template would have been moved along and drawn round again. So although you could position the repeat motifs along the first strip going across, going up the side once you got beyond there was more difficult. You could put it here and then turn it round and do it here and then again, but you might easily get to the end of the quilt and not be able to fit a repeat motif in, and not even be able to stretch or squash it, and then you would have just had to give in and had a part motif instead. You couldn't go back and correct it. So that means, for example, that this is definitely the end of the quilt that was done last. The paisleys are not too bad, although there's a part one there and a part of one here, but where you really notice it is with the bent leaves on the outer border. She's had problems here and here, and it's not been very successful in the way she's managed to fit them in. The quilter who made this managed the first end of the quilt quite successfully. We've got bent leaves on this quilt too, which go quite nicely to the corner. She's then made a butted corner and put those to continue up here. What happens when she got to the other end? You can see that she had more space than she needed, and so she's turned round the leaf so it's almost vertical here, and she's moved the position of the spiral. Instead of being in between the leaves, she's had to put it at the end to try and fill the space in to make it look reasonably neat and tidy. This Welsh quilt from Ammanford, probably made in the 1930s, is much better planned. This probably would have been marked, at least in part, before putting in the frame. You can see that she uses a large fan at the corners and then has repeating designs of hearts and flowers which are evenly spaced and placed to fill the border very nicely. She's even managed to cope with the fact that on this rectangular quilt she needs 2 hearts and 3 flowers along the long edge, but only 2 flowers and 1 heart along the shorter edge. This is one of my favourite quilts. It has 4 borders of varying widths and is a beautiful example of how you can use a corner motif to avoid making the design turn the corners. We've got beech leaves, a little grid and a 4-pointed flower. There are more photographs of this quilt made by Q.L. Jones in the Antique Quilts section of my website. Have a look there to see all the fudges I discovered, which are not immediately obvious, but which can help us work out which way round the quilt was stitched. So how have I used this tactic on my own quilts? Neither the patchwork or the quilting go around the corner on the borders of this small quilt I made, inspired by traditional Welsh designs. Let's have a look at a close-up. On this inner border, on the mustard part, I could have made this square with spiral inside design on the corner as well, but I chose to use this small beech leaf. And a bigger beech leaf comes on the corner of the outer border. It's really important here because it would have been much more difficult to make this church window design extend and go round the corner smoothly, so the beech leaf is a good way of avoiding the corner here. I did manage to make it work on the middle border though, the stripy one. If you look, this has a design of beech leaves which zigzag in an alternating design, and it does fit nicely with that one that goes into the corner. This makes a corner design which is integral with the whole border. This whole cloth quilt which I designed is called Cream of Wales and is again based on traditional Welsh designs. I've used the church window border again. I haven't tried to turn the corner. I've put one of those big fans like we saw on the Ammanford quilt earlier. And this little cable, well, that just comes to a point, so I don't need to turn the corner there either. And in this central section we have the traditional square corners. Here's a cardiganshire heart in this one, which again means that these designs don't need to go around the corner smoothly. Even on much simpler designs you can use a corner motif. I avoided turning the corner with the border design on this Jacob's Ladder quilt, the first full-size quilt I ever made. A pieced block at a border corner is a good way of avoiding the need to make a more complex design, such as these quilted swags. Avoid turning the corner. The pattern for this Friendship Star Quillo is one of those available from my website shop if you would like to make this yourself. The instructions cover the quilting as well as the patchwork. It's designed to be a skill builder project. Back to the antiques again. Another region of the UK with a strong tradition of whole cloth quilts is the North East. Earlier designs show corner styles relatively similar to the Welsh designs. This beautiful white quilt was made as a present for a wedding in 1902 and displays a carefully planned number of circular motifs repeated to form the outer border. The inner border is of a running feather, but she doesn't try to make this turn round properly. She's got a rose which avoids the turn in the corner there. This one is also in the antiques quilt section of our website. Look out for the North Country Harl Wedding whole cloth. The border is a design related to a plait, and then we just have this large tulip which goes over the top of them and avoids the need for that plait to turn the corner. No mouths at all. Notice the difference between this and the Welsh quilts. There are none of those square lines making the box at the corner. You don't find these dividing lines at all on North Country quilts after the turn of the 20th century. What you do find is all the motifs just flow into one another, often with this background quilting pattern of the square diamonds. This is one way of making a border with a repeated motif such as a fan. Although these do actually touch on here, if you needed to spread them out a little bit more, you could easily leave a little space between them. An arrangement like this which fits repeated units into the border size is relatively easy to plan. Where the difference comes is in the corners. On North Country quilts, the corner motifs became much more elaborate than the Welsh designs, spilling out of the corner design into the central area. This example, dating from the 1920s, 1930s, is the one with the fan border, but we also have this spray of feathers which comes out from the corner into the central area. Another North Country quilt that was made for a wedding is this one, which was made by Jane Rochester for her wedding in 1899. She had repeated units along the border, but then she had this beautiful corner made up of these lovely curving feathers, and then we have a heart, and we also have a horseshoe. Eventually I realised that these North Country quilters were using a different sort of avoid corner. I'm sure that these elaborate corners were in fact planned first, and then the border motifs fitted into the remaining space. But of course this style of design needed to be marked on the whole quilt before putting it in the frame. You couldn't mark it with templates like I described earlier. And in fact these sophisticated designs were often the work of professional quilt stampers who designed and marked quilt tops for others to stitch. So this quilt, for example, was probably marked professionally. Remember that little geometry was taught to girls, despite the strong emphasis given in schools to the teaching of sewing skills. George Gardner, who was a draper in Allenheads, a village in the North Pennines, started this flowing style, which became very popular. His most well-known apprentice was Elizabeth Sanderson. She could apparently mark 2 quilt tops a day. People would send her fabric through the post from all over the north of England, and she would draw on the fabric with a waxy blue pencil and post them back, so that the quilters could stitch over the marked lines themselves. Here's another example of this typical style, with lots of flowers, flowing feathers, swags, little curlicues to fill up the spaces, and again a design which protrudes out from the corner to make a much more elaborate motif. This is another quilt made in the Durham area, made by Isabella Tucker, who was a miner's wife who made and sold quilts to add to the family income. She kept this one for her own visitors after making it in the 1930s. And you can see how beautifully planned it is. These feathers, which come in pairs to form these bellows, are planned very carefully to make a symmetrical design. She still uses this technique, however, of putting a corner motif on top of the cable to avoid making the cable turn the corners. Turning the corners beautifully was what I expected to find when I started looking, these master corners. And to my initial surprise, this was by far the smallest category of corner I found. There are very few. On reflection, the difficulty of making it work perhaps explains its scarcity. Despite this, there are, however, some 18th and early 19th century wholecloth quilts, which are amazingly well planned and executed. Unfortunately, I don't own any of these, as they're predominantly now found in museum collections. I'll just show you a couple of nice corners that I did find, where the pattern did flow around the corner. This one, for example, on a quilt belonging to Jenny Jarvis, shows how a cable can turn the corner very nicely, with this extra little flourish here. This is another cable turning a corner on one of my quilts. Not quite as sophisticated as the last one, more functional really. But again, it's a design where the lines go into the corner, and it could actually be quite easily fudged, this one. If you hadn't quite the spacing you intended, you could have a few less or few more lines and fudge it and make it work. So if you're wanting to plan the perfect corner for your quilted border, how can you do it? Well, don't be afraid to use these simpler tactics. The ignore, avoid or fudging corners. They can be surprisingly successful. But if you do want to make it sweep round the corner in a perfectly planned way, this can be achieved. A good place to start might be to use a stencil. Look out for stencils which include a corner, such as the one I used here on this plait on the outer border. Stencils, of course, unfortunately, only usually come in one size, and that might not be quite right for the size of quilt that you have. This plait, for example, is a bit wide. It's a bit too close to this outside edge here. So you really need to think about the size of the stencil and whether it's going to work. In fact, I have been known to plan the size of the quilt around the size of the stencil that I want to use, such as this different plait one that I had here, which has rather a nice corner. I planned the size of the border so that I would have a little bit of free space on either side, and also so that the length of the border repeat fitted exactly into the size of the border that I had. Jack-in-a-Box was an early quilt where I decided to design the quilting border myself. This egg and dart design that we have here, this oval is the egg and this pointy bit is the dart, in fact is made up just from half circles, like that, and then the same the other way up. The size of the curve can easily be chosen. so that a multiple of that just equals the border length that we need. As there are only 2 lines, it was then easier to experiment and design a simple corner that would join them up. The outer border of this miniature quilt was drawn using a fancy stencil, but for the inner border I used the egg and dart again. Let's have a look at a close-up, and you can see that I used a different corner that I designed this time, with this spiky bit in the corner. A common feature for border designs is something that has a waving spine, and usually you make that sweep round in a U motif like this. You can see the similar structure has been used on Irish squares, and it has this nice paisley feather swirl in each loop. I did have a little problem when I designed this though. Because the quilt is rectangular, it proved impossible to find a size for the border repeat which worked for both the short sides and the long sides. So in fact, for the top and bottom borders, the waving spine of the design is stretched a little bit so that it reached the end in the right place. The size of the paisley swirls is the same, but the size of this little section which joins them together is very slightly different on this side than it is on this side. You probably can't tell that because I've fudged it really well. So, how could you make sure that everything fits on your quilt perfectly without the need for any fudging at all? Well, something like the egg and dart we had a moment ago with the part circles is relatively easy to calculate, but for a more complicated design such as a cable, you do need to do some planning beforehand. You need to decide on a width and a length for your cable repeat. So here, for example, you would measure the width of your border without the seam allowance, and then subtract at least another ½ inch to give yourself a little bit of breathing space around the design on the inner and the outer edge, and also you need to avoid anywhere which perhaps has a seam pressed underneath, because that's going to make your quilting more difficult. So the border width minus that gives you the cable width. Don't worry about trying to remember all this, by the way. You can find it on my website on the page about drafting cable borders. Now you need to find a suitable length for your cable. Make sure you know that we're not going to use the outer border length. We're going to think about the inner border length. So in other words, we're not at the moment going to worry about the corners. You can work out how many repeats will then fit into this inner border length, either by dividing by whole numbers or by pleating a piece of paper that you've cut to length, if you find it easier to manipulate something by hand. Again, more details of this are available in the Drafting Cables pack, available from my online shop. Now, once you know the length and the width of the cable you need a grid of that size, and then you can draw it out. The grid helps the design to be drawn symmetrically and smoothly so that you can get a nice even result. I'm just going to go through this very quickly here. The cables pack does contain more detailed step-by-step instructions. So on your grid, which is the right length and the right width, you put a few reference marks in, and then you start to join them up. So the first lines go from these dots here, through the lines here, back to the dots on the other side. And the same is done underneath. Then we add some more lines which extend out to the X, and we put a curve here which parallels the outer curve for an inner egg shape. Then we extend the ends until it's like this, and then finally we extend from the X again to echo those outer curves. And essentially you now have the outline of your cable. You can now add lines inside parallel to the edge to give it more strands. Here, for instance, I've got a 4-strand cable, but it's easy enough to make a different number of strands if you prefer. You notice that the cable has come out a certain size depending on the size of the grid. And if we change the proportions of the background grid, that will change the style of the cable. So for instance, we could squash it to make a short fat cable, or we could change the dimensions the other directions to make a longer thinner cable. Our background squares of the grid are no longer square, but that doesn't matter because we're still going from the same places marked with the letters and the numbers. So once we know how to draw the cable, if we change the proportions of the background grid, that means that we can make the cable the right size. And I've designed a special grid on the computer that can be stretched or squashed to whatever shape or size is needed. So you adjust the size of the grid to be the right size, and then you draw your cable on using the same rules. It's the same way of drawing it, whatever the size of the background grid. And this is the details of the pack that contains this. If you'd be interested in buying it, it's £8. There is another techniques pack as well, which teaches you how to draft a running feather design. Both packs include the Microsoft Word file for the master grid, so that then you can adjust your grid to be the right shape and size to fit any size quilt. They also include suggestions for how to do the corners. So you need 2 of your ready drawn cables and a corner square ready to now design the corner. It's a good idea to put a diagonal line in like this, because you're quite often going to want to make your corner balance on both sides the same way. Then you think, well, how can I join things up? So the easiest thing here is to join these 3 lines with a smooth curve around the corner. Now, what shall we do to join these 3 to those 3? We could just put a curve round again, but maybe you'd like to make them go out like that. That looks a bit more interesting, doesn't it? We could do that with the outside ones. We could change that curve to make it look like that if we wanted to instead. And maybe we could add an extra loop on there just to give it an individual touch. This is a way of making your corner designs unique to you. So for example, on this quilt, the main part of the quilt had tulips as part of the quilting. And can you see that I incorporated the tulip into the border, into the corner. Here's another example where the design of the border echoes the hearts that are in the main applique part, and if I show you a close-up of the corner, you can see that the hearts and the feathers were used to design a corner which was completely individual and sympathetic to the rest of the design too. One of the things that helped me with this design process was studying far more antique quilts. And I did this after I'd won the Amy Ems Award in April 2016. Amy Ems was a North Country quilter who was very influential in keeping the world of hand quilting going throughout the second half of the 20th century. And a bursary in her name is available to a Quilters Guild member every 2 years. I chose to spend my bursary on getting some really good quality photographs done of some of my antique quilts so that you could share with me in studying the border corners. So it seems appropriate that we finish with a final slide showing the master hand of Amy Ems at work. This quilt is shown by permission of the Quilters Guild. It's part of their collection. And it shows a beautiful feathered cable around the border, one of Amy's favourites. And of course, it's perfectly balanced to fit and sweep round each corner in her masterful way. I hope that this has inspired you to design your own quilting designs for borders and to use some of the tactics I've shared with you today for the corners.